Okay, looks like we're live. Okay, well, hello to everybody out there in YouTube land, UVU students and others who are joining us for our final session of this year's UVU Environmental Ethics Symposium. And we are privileged to have a final session that is going to be led by Julie Ramos, who will be talking about perfect climate for hunger, what it means to be a woman in the global climate crisis. The global climate crisis intersects with access to healthy and sufficient food and clean drinking water, in part because, as many of you know, the areas of the world that are experiencing the strongest impacts of climate change are also the ones experiencing the greatest levels of food insecurity. And Julie Ramos is working on that. She has worked for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saint Charities, the humanitarian arm of the church, since 2017. She manages the food security and clean water portfolios. Prior to joining LDS Charities, she worked as the grants manager at United Way of Salt Lake, 5 years working in Washington, D.C. for Ashoka, an organization that finds and supports social entrepreneurs throughout the world. She holds a master's degree in public administration from BYU with an emphasis in nonprofit management. And she's also worked and consulted in Egypt, Ghana, Nigeria, Mexico, and Brazil. She loves storytelling, music, dance, and coconut, and is passionate about ending global hunger. Julie, take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Michael. I'm excited to be with everyone today. And I think either lucky or not so lucky that I have the final spot in the lineup. But what's been really exciting for me has been listening to some of the other sessions. And I just have to say, wow, it's a privilege for me to be part of this day today and just to be involved with this event and everything that I've learned from all of the incredible women that have been part of this. So thank you. Okay, I am going to share my screen. And hopefully that is working there. My objective today is to really bring awareness to the impact that climate has on women and hunger, which is a very global issue, but I'm also hoping that we can take a look at this global challenge and personalize it a bit more today and talk about what it means. So in terms of our agenda and what we can expect just over the next little bit, I will share some data on global hunger, talk about some of the root causes, talk about how women and girls particularly are impacted. And what I want to spend most of my time on is, not all the gloom and doom, but really shed some light and hope on things that we're learning. As Michael said, I represent Latter-day Saint Charities, which is the humanitarian arm of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And over the last 4 years, I've been managing a clean water and food security portfolio. And we've learned a lot, particularly over the last 2 years and in a global pandemic. But I'm hoping to share a number of things that we've learned that through the different initiatives that we funded that help to mitigate some of the climate-induced hunger around the world. And if you do find at all that your mind is wandering, over the next couple of minutes, think back to this question: what does it mean to be a woman in the global climate crisis? Okay, so starting out, this map shows global hunger. This is from the World Food Program. And what this is showing is chronic hunger. What that means is hunger, people that are experiencing hunger over longer periods of time. So it's not necessarily brought on by a one-time event, but it's long-term. It may be annual seasons of hunger that people go through. And although hunger has been severely exacerbated by COVID-19, the reality is that it was already on the rise and significantly on the rise. As you can see from this map here, sub-Saharan Africa Southeast Asia, parts of Latin America really are the areas of the world that are experiencing the most hunger. And interestingly is that the driving, I would say one of the most significant drivers of this rise in hunger is climate. So I want to share a specific climate incident. In May of 2019, a powerful tropical cyclone made a surprising landfall over the typically dry Arabian Peninsula. And you can kind of see that pictured here as it's about to make landfall there. And this unusual heavy rainfall created pockets of warm and wet soil like this. It might be kind of difficult to see exactly what this is, but this is actually an aerial view that shows kind of this dry soil now with pockets of water and flooding. And then what happened is a second cyclone hit 5 months later, and it created an ideal breeding ground for desert locusts or really large grasshoppers. And what happened was that this changed their usual phase into a much more gregarious phase, drastically increasing the number of insects or locusts. And shortly after that, again, another cyclone hit, which facilitated the migration of these locusts into further parts of East Africa, places like Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Somalia, etc., which were already places where the infrastructure was severely compromised, and food security was already a threat for millions of people. So if you can't tell from this image here, those are the locusts. And this woman, her name is Susan, she's from Kenya. She is frantically swatting at these locusts who are eating her crop. This field, kind of in the background, you can see the corn or the maize that she is growing. And this image is just so striking to me because we're talking a locust invasion of biblical proportions, right? A locust invasion that part of our, Utah history also is familiar with, that severely devastated crops. Susan said, when they came, you could not even see the sun. All you can do is just wait, which really, drives that home, kind of what that was like to have that kind of invasion of these locusts. A small swarm of these locusts can and did consume the same amount of food in one day as 35,000 people. And in some of those countries that I mentioned, the swarms lasted for months or even up to 300 days, off and on. So imagine the loss of crop that we're referring to. And knowing that the majority of the world's poor are farmers means that they heavily rely on agriculture for their livelihood. It means that what they are growing, they're eating for their own consumption and for their family. And it also means that what they are growing, they are selling, right? It's their income. And so this is just severe devastation that has drastically increased the amount of hunger that people around the world have faced. So I want to talk about just a couple other compounding factors of hunger. Obviously, climate being the most significant driver, or at least one of the most significant drivers of hunger. When you think about all these climate-related things that farmers face, drought, flooding, erratic rainfall, or even unpredictable rainfall, poor soil quality, poor seed quality, right? Scarce water resources, all of these are related to climate. And again, what happens is that as climate changes and as there's more severe weather patterns, these farmers are particularly impacted, and their families face often what's called a lean season, where they experience periods of fasting after a harvest, where they're not able to feed their family or have to skip meals. And what's really interesting is that 80% of the world's hungry people live in places prone to natural disasters and environmental degradation, creating the perfect climate for hunger. Love that. Sad. I mean, it's just a powerful thing to think about. Disease also, climate change is further intensifying the threat of some of the biggest killers of children, which is diarrhea, malnutrition, and malaria. And so much of the disease that we're referring to here is waterborne, right? It's not having proper water or sanitation. Children then don't have the proper growth or nutrients. Malnutrition is so linked to water, and so much of it is related to water scarcity or just not having clean water, further creating, again, poor nutrition and hunger. Conflict, another obvious driver of hunger. I think Yemen is a perfect example of this, where the conflict there has essentially been turned into a war on hunger, where food systems have been drastically disrupted and many people are going hungry. And then last and not surprisingly, gender inequality is one of the most significant drivers of hunger. Women make up 50% of the agricultural workforce in developing countries, but own less than 20% of the land, and women account for 60% of the world's hungry. And I'll talk in the next slides a little bit more about some of that data and what we're learning. But I think it's important to just note that each of these areas, they really do intersect with each other. But what they all have, or I should say, and what they all have in common is that they impact women and children the most. 2/3 in all countries, 2/3 in all of all countries, women are more likely than men to report food insecurity. And 60% of the 690 million people who are food insecure are women and girls. So again, just further data that's showing that women or girls are far more impacted by hunger and climate-induced hunger. 200 million is the number of hours that women and girls spend collecting water every day. And I think that's an interesting data point that's actually been referenced a couple of other times earlier throughout the sessions today, just the role of women and girls with water. And 80% of people displaced by climate change are women. So the question then that bringing everything back to is, what does it mean to be a woman in the climate crisis? And in summary, I'll say that women are hungrier. And just kind of sit with that for a moment. And maybe even think about the women in your own life, right? And the caretakers that you have and the sacrifices that they make. We know that 85 to 90% of time spent on household food preparation is women's time. Unfortunately, in many places, outdated gender norms mean that women are hungrier when food is scarce. When water sources dry up due to droughts or heat waves, as we've talked about, it's the women and the girls who have to walk further distance to collect water for their families. Many girls miss school. Women miss other opportunities for economic inclusion because of this, having to spend a significant amount of time collecting water. And in many countries, tradition dictates that women eat last after all the male members and children have been fed. So I want to dive a little bit deeper into what does this look like? And I'm going to share in the next slide, and this is probably my favorite slide, the next two slides, really fascinating information that one of our NGO partners that the church works with International Development Enterprises, IDE. What they did was they surveyed men and women that live in northern Ghana. So keep in mind, this data that I'm going to show really just represents this population that was surveyed. So women and men in northern Ghana, which is a very rural part. But what they did was surveyed them and really wanted to create this journey map, right? A day in the life. What does it look like for a woman? And then on the next slide, what does it look like for a man? If you note, kind of the yellow smiling circles are moments where the women, they would go throughout their day and say, here are the things that I do in my day. And these are the things that essentially are moments of delight or things that bring me joy. And kind of the red, frowny faces are things that they identified as moments of difficulty. And I just find this so fascinating. So a couple of things to point out here. Notice the time of day. On average, that these women are waking up 3:30 to 4:30 in the morning, right? That would be a moment of difficulty for me too, if I had to wake up that early every morning. Definitely moments of joy as they're getting ready, as they bathe, as they pray. But then right at the beginning of the day, we're looking at quite a few moments of difficulty where for some reason or another they identified this as just a challenging part of their day, collecting water, collecting wood, starting a fire, eating water for baths, sweeping. The next part of the day is kind of waking their children up, caring for the children, getting them fed. And obviously, that brings them a lot of joy. And then they begin working. And if it's not working in their fields, then it's lunch or going back to their fields in the afternoon, or their other sources of livelihood. And then dinner. And then kind of the end evening after dinner routine. So just notice that, unless a woman is generating her income at home, she's typically out of her home all day, right? Whether she's collecting wood or water or out in her fields, which the majority of these women surveyed were out, working in their fields, in their farms. Obviously, physically taking care of their children was their biggest priority. But there's not really a whole lot of time for anything else beyond, taking care of your family. Now, in comparison, I'm going to share the men that were surveyed, and men that are listening, and Michael, please know that I share this just to get a sense of what those who were surveyed were experiencing. And this was the day in the life of the men in rural, northern part of Ghana. Notice the moments of delight represented by those yellow smiley faces versus the moment of difficulty. According to the survey, the men's only unhappy point was having to wake up 2 hours after their wife. And again, I say that just to put into perspective what many women around the world are facing. This is the reality of the world that we live in, that there are extreme gender norms and societal norms that are hurting and disadvantaging women. And I think this information is important for me as someone who works in the international development space, in the humanitarian space. As I look for organizations to support, I often think, am I placing extra burdens on women, or am I helping them? Am I helping to mitigate or relieve some of the existing burdens that they have? And what this does mean for us and for hunger is that already, again, going back to this previous slide, there are so many burdens on women, now added hunger, now added not being able to have water, right? Or cook for your children, or not knowing if your fields, the maize or the corn or the sorghum or whatever you're growing is going to feed your family that season after your harvest. It is significantly more challenging for a woman who is trying to feed her family, who is also facing erratic weather patterns and changes in the climate, she is the one facing those burdens. Now, in comparison, and this is where I maybe want to shift gears a little bit here. FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, said, by providing women farmers the same access to productive resources as men, productive resources meaning kind of agricultural productive resources, the number of hungry people in the world would reduce by 12 to 17%. And that percentage represents roughly 150 million people. So that number of people would not be going hungry if women had the same access to resources as men. So what can we do? Kind of in summary, women need access. And what I want to do in the next few slides is to share, again, what some of the things that I have learned, that we as an organization, as Latter-day Saint Charities, has learned in our work to end global hunger. We partner with a number of organizations, and our goal is really to increase food security and improve nutrition for families. And I just want to share 4 things that we're learning that women need access to help break these cycles of hunger and mitigate climate-induced hunger. So the first one is agricultural inputs. And really what that means is seeds, tools, fertilizer, very simple but quality agricultural inputs. And I'll share a few examples in some of the following slides. Access to training. And very, I should say, just changing the way that these women have worked. Typically, they farm and they use traditions that have been passed on from their mothers and grandmothers. And there's a lot that can be done to grow more with access to new training around agriculture production. And related to that, access to climate smart technologies that can be water smart or help increase water availability. And the last one is market linkages, also a very important one. And this is the ability to not just grow more, but to be connected to the right resources to be able to sell or to increase your income. So just a few examples. Now, agricultural inputs. This is a photo of a woman in Tanzania. Her name is Pendo Malata, and she is a farmer that works with 1 Acre Fund, which is an organization that we highly recommend and have worked with for a number of years. Typically, she is 100% reliant on rainfall to grow her crop. And as you can see, she's holding maize or corn. She also happens to be a single mother of 5 children. And so she relies on the income from her crop to feed her family. And of course, if she's relying on rainfall, then she's used to having a lot of uncertainty. The kind of agricultural inputs, though, that she's been provided or had the access to, with access to finance and other capital, she's been able to get quality seeds that are often drought-resistant seeds, which can sometimes offer a better yield for her crop. 1 Acre Fund is an organization that also offers a package to farmers so that they're purchasing not just a cash crop, but other seeds and vegetables so that they can diversify their crop a bit more. And that type of intercropping not only can improve diet if you're also eating those vegetables, but can heavily improve the soil quality. Another example, also from this organization, 1 Acre Fund, of agricultural inputs is providing seedlings or these tree seedlings to family. This image is a woman and her children from Malawi Her name is Yulia, and they grow trees to help improve the soil quality, but to also, for a number of reasons, improve some of the land that has been deforested throughout Malawi. She noted, and a quote that she shared with us was that trees are an investment not only in her future, but in her children's future. And we know that this allows her to have a better crop as she uses those trees to improve the quality of the soil, but also to provide some coverage and shading for some of her crops. Okay, the second is access to agricultural training. These two images, the one on the left here is an image, both are from Madagascar, but the one on the left is crop or maize that has been grown, probably dried, although maybe not properly. And as you can see, it's being stored. If you can tell, this is a room, this is a home, a one-bedroom home in the southern part of Madagascar, and most of it is being stored under the bed. Now, there's some that is out on the floor. They just had it out that day, but they were putting it in a bag and kind of tying the bag. And unfortunately, what happens is that 30% of yield, of crop yield, that around the world that farmers grow is lost. And that's just such a significant amount of food waste that can be mitigated. Oh, excuse me. And it's lost due to not being properly stored or dried, and so becomes infested either with bugs or is wet and moldy. And what we do, the type of training, is we look for organizations that can support reducing this type of post-harvest loss for women and their families. So the picture on the right, we work with World Food Program in Madagascar, and what you're seeing are hermetic storage containers or bags, or airtight, right? Either the silo grains or those bags that they help teach them, show how to be airtight. They provide this type of training so that these families can store their crop, sell it at better times in the market, not right after harvest when everyone else is selling, or consume it throughout the year at different points and not just right after their harvest. A second example of agricultural training and access to agricultural training is really around kind of water smart or trainings. This picture here is a woman in West Africa. She is digging what's called zai pits, and it's essentially rainwater harvesting technologies. So it's commonly practiced, and it's a way to dig a little bit deeper, plant in these pits, and then better store kind of the water in the ground and the rainwater within those pits. And that's something that we recognize as really critically important, that even though climate is having a huge impact on farmers, there are some things, in small ways that can be done to mitigate some of the impacts that climate has on these farmer families. Okay, climate smart technologies. The picture here is from an organization, IDE, again, that did that same journey map. This is actually in Bangladesh, and you can see the woman on the far end of the picture. She's putting water from a bucket into a tank. She's using what's called a drip irrigation system that minimizes water runoff and evaporation. Also wind drift, it minimizes some of that by delivering kind of that slow, steady stream of water. And if you can see the green lines, that's the drip irrigation that's slowly dripping from the tank into kind of the root zone of what she's growing. And this is one way, not everyone has access to this type of technology, but one way that is fairly low cost that helps to provide water to crops, not just rely on rainfall, but mitigate some of those challenges when you are relying on rainfall. The other piece too, though, is what's so beautiful about this technology is that It's a labor savings aspect, right? Women don't have to spend so much time out in their fields watering their crop each day if they do have access to water, but the drip irrigation allows that to have a steady stream on its own. And a second example of a climate smart technology that I want to share is the use of SMS messaging, which again, very low cost technology, but with a number of organizations that we've partnered with, one in particularly Myagro that works primarily in West Africa. They send these messages to thousands of farmers. And particularly messages around, what's the weather today, if it's likely going to dry or when it's supposed to rain. And for these farmers, who many of them live in, these tropic zones, which weather can be very unpredictable, hard to predict, but there are services and technologies that can accurately, or more accurately, I should say, than others, predict the weather. By sharing that information with farmers, it then helps them to know best days to plant, best times to harvest, etc. And last, I want to share two examples of market linkages. This image here is a woman in Ghana. This is an organization that we support through our WASH, or Water and Sanitation portfolio. The organization is Saha Global, again, that works in northern Ghana. And it's a really neat entrepreneurial model where they basically provide women with a business in a box, if you will, kind of the inputs to start a water business. And much of the water source that these women are accessing are these dugouts, kind of this open pooled area where there's water, but it's contaminated water. And so they provide the materials and the training for these women to collect the water, put it into these tanks, filter it through chlorine tablets and other uses, and then have a water business where people come and access through this tap here the water and pay for it right there. And so it's this really neat kind of market-based approach to water. And oftentimes, a lot of the water that's collected from these women-run businesses is used not just for drinking water, but for agricultural purposes as well. And the second example of market linkages that I'd like to share, also from IDE, is a really interesting model that they have that's called the Farm Business Advisor. This is a family in Mozambique. This woman, her name is Berta, and she and her husband jointly manage kind of an entrepreneurial business. They're called Farm Business Advisors, and they work directly with other farmers within their local community. And what IDE does is train them to essentially create better access to markets, both on the kind of planting side, whether it's agro dealers or seed suppliers, getting them to come to their small rural community and sell their seeds to other farmers and women and men who need them. Or if it's on kind of the harvesting side, they'll work with this group of farmers and aggregate their crop and then sell their crop to a more stable market, such as a hotel or a hospital, in some cases schools. So instead of having to sell on these roadside clinics and not having really stable access to markets, this husband-wife duo was able to make those linkages, and then on both ends of that supply chain, they are able to negotiate a commission, which allows them to build their business and increase the work that they do in their own farm. And what I absolutely love about this example is that by having this partnership, this duo, right, with the two spouses, they are able to jointly make decisions in their business. And Berta shared that allowed her to feel that she also had a voice within her household. And she's seen how she and her husband are better able to manage household resources or their cash flow because they're jointly making decisions together. Okay, so in summary, a quote from the United Nations: gender equality is the single most important determinant of food security. So again, just kind of thinking, so what? What does this mean for us? And kind of sitting with that for a moment. For me, I think it means that if I want to help eliminate hunger in any country, right, including high-income countries, including here in the US, the number one thing that I would start doing is elevating the role and voice of women as the single most factor that influences hunger. Now, at a more personal level, I also think about my daughter. I have a 4-year-old who is an incredible human being, bright red hair. She loves being outside. She loves worms and animals and taking care of all the creatures on the earth. And I want to teach her to use her voice and help instill within her permission to think big and be a change maker within her own community. So again, I strongly believe, and quoting again, that gender equality is the single most important determinant of food security. And just to wrap up, one thing that I always like to share is this seems like such a global, complex problem. What can we do? And I'll say start with 3 things. Obviously, this is not the end all, but 3 things. 1, serve locally, find ways to get involved within your local community. 2, give globally. There are incredible organizations around the world that are on the ground, boots on the ground, and are trying to address some of these challenges around climate-induced hunger, and they need resources and support. And number 3 is to become an advocate. Get involved, be passionate about an issue and learn the various aspects of that issue. In terms of other kind of individual involvement, I shared just a list again, and a few things that I've thought of, not end all at all, but things that we can do at an individual level while these challenges are so complex and systemic, and in many cases institutional. So just quickly going through this list: vote for green policies, start a community garden, support your local farmers, organize a meal packaging event or assist in a local food bank, reduce consumption or cut consumption and waste, particularly around food waste, and educate your circle of influence. Again, this idea of becoming an advocate. And last, if anyone is interested in diving further into this, there's a few other resources. You're more than welcome to follow Latter-day Saint Charities. Our website has a lot of information about the types of organizations that we invest in. Facebook and Instagram, you can Google Latter-day Saint Charities and find those and learn more. JustServe.org is a platform that connects volunteers to volunteer opportunities, and many of them are tied to food banks or addressing local hunger. And then some of these others are just, again, if you want to take a screenshot, if there's anything that you want to dive into and learn more about, just one that I would recommend, consultative group on international agriculture research, International Food Policy Research Institute, the Global Hunger Index, Food Systems Summit. That is a generally in-person event, but it's been shifted to virtual in the past few years. And then evidence-based implementing organizations. We shared just a list, logos of organizations that we partner with or support in some way, many of which I have learned from personally, and I'm very grateful for these organizations who really are impacting women and children around the world. So those are some that I would highly recommend looking into and learning more about. And with that, Michael, I'll kind of stop sharing my screen here and would love to turn it back over to questions.
Thank you so much, Julia. Julie, there's just so much to unpack there, so I think we should just get with the questions. The first question actually came from about the moment you cited this statistic early on in your talk. The figure that 80% of people displaced by climate disasters are women was striking. What are some of the factors behind this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, obviously factors driving climate and climate migration, I think are pretty clear, right? In terms of these people who are relying on their crops and then having to migrate because of just unpredictable weather patterns. Now, the reason for it being 80% women is a really good question. I think the best answer to that is largely just to look at other demographics of women, and particularly women living in poverty. While I don't have the exact statistics, a large number are single-headed, let's see, households headed by single women, right? Women and children who are relying so heavily on agriculture and then need to migrate. So I think there's probably a lot of other things to unpack there, but I think that's one of the biggest drivers, is that already we're seeing that even without, some of these climate issues, these are single-headed households or groups of women who are raising families together.
When I sort of add something to that, and Julie, maybe you can confirm or tell me if you think this is true, but like that the cyclone example that you showed in the locusts originally was not just the story, but the photography that was stunning, I thought. And I was just thinking, well, that cyclone probably wiped out some of the infrastructure that delivered clean water. Mm-hmm. And what you said about women being responsible for carrying the water from point A to point B. So they're the ones who are bearing the burdens of the same kind of water that's also harboring the diseases you talked about, cholera, I think. And you mentioned cholera, but you mentioned waterborne diseases being one of the things that really crippled areas being hit by the cyclone.
Mm-hmm. Right, absolutely. And I think what's so fascinating about that example is we've seen this before. These locust plagues are not unheard of in this part of the world, but they were just so much further exacerbated because of the cyclone season, right? It's this climate issue, and so I think for me what's really interesting is that whether we're talking about drought or cyclones or flooding, these climate issues, it's all about water, right? It's a water issue is what we're really talking about. And when you don't have access to water, for not just drinking, but for agriculture, that's driving so much other change, including migration.
Okay, our next question, what are some of the responsibilities that we in rich countries have in terms of environmental sustainability?
Yeah, great question. As I mentioned, I do think that we have a responsibility. A lot of the examples that I've shared, although we're from low-income countries, there's a lot of examples that I could have shared from high-income countries. The church, in fact, invests right here in the U.S. On water projects where there's about 2 million people in the U.S. that don't have access to clean water. I know that was mentioned earlier by Senator Escamilla as well. It's a tough question. I think largely it would be easy to argue to say that any kind of change to reduce this impact that we're seeing, kind of the factors of climate change, is a very systemic, right, institutional, right? We really need these big, large organizations to change how they're operating. But I really do believe that there is individual responsibility as well. And so, some of those things I mentioned in terms of, reducing consumption or voting for greener policies, getting involved in hunger issues within your own community, whether it's through a food bank or finding other ways to just elevate women's voices. Again, number one thing that will impact hunger, and probably many, many other things, is just that ability to give women a voice and bring them into decision making.
So to summarize, would you argue that supporting women is not just supporting women, but also a climate strategy too?
100%, right. And that's what I would say. Yeah, to reduce hunger, to reduce climate-induced hunger. Yes.
Okay.
Elevating the voice and the role of women is absolutely, not just a hunger strategy, it's a climate strategy as well.
Thanks. All right, we have a longer question that's really well thought out. I want to make sure I do it justice in the way I read it. So if you give me a moment to make sure I spin it out well. The questioner asks, you mentioned your concern about not adding extra burdens to women when implementing programs. Can you share a time where a well-intentioned program didn't serve women's needs? Or can you talk a little more about the ways programs think through their efforts to reduce rather than accidentally increase the burden on women?
I love this question. Thank you to whoever shared that. Brilliant question. I think I want to answer that and just share a couple of examples of programs that we are funding, that we have found that have been able to find ways to have this gender lens and not place extra burdens. And I think what happens, it's good intentions, right? It's organizations and people who go in with a solution without really understanding the problem. The number one thing that a program or an organization or a community-based organization needs to do is design a solution that is human-centered, right? This idea of human-centered design, which means, number one, not just knowing the population that you're working with, but bringing them into the solution. So we like to find organizations that have that at their core, right? This is part of their core values to use human-centered design in understanding, how the women are being impacted, in having them design solutions, right? That's kind of the number one thing that we would recommend in terms of agents. Two, it's also finding things that are already part of a broader solution. So for example, I've seen a lot of interventions where an organization will say, oh, let's create this women's group, and then we'll bring them together and teach them how to grow this certain crop, and then we'll provide ongoing training. Well, the reality is women are already meeting in groups, right? One thing that I didn't talk about that was on that slide, kind of the day in the life, is that a lot of kind of those joy moments are the social network, social interaction. So whether it's going to get water or working in the fields, these women are doing it in groups, right? That's part of their social interaction. And so organizations, finding ways to tap into these existing networks, or oftentimes there's what's called a village savings and loan association, which are these kind of small women's groups that exist in almost every community, right? Don't create something new. Tap into these existing social networks and structures, but do it in a way that's human-centered, that brings in the women so that they are the ones designing the solution. They are closest to the problem. They will know the problem far better than anyone else, and so they are the experts. They will also be able to know and understand that, or define the solution. So that would be kind of my guidance in what we've learned in fighting and supporting organizations that are trying to reduce burdens on women.
So it sounds like you're saying do more, don't just seek out local input, but be intentional enough to seek communities, and communities specifically of women, who will be impacted by whatever policies or solutions are put forth.
Correct. And invite them in the design, right, of any solution.
Okay, great. Okay, we're at time, but you know what? There's not another session after this, so I'm going to take the last question, if you don't mind, Julie.
Sure.
Okay. How does global inequality fit into these issues of hunger and gender inequality? Which I think has been to a degree some of the theme, but of what you've talked about.
Yeah, I think the reality is often, even so, I'm going to use an example from WASH, or from water and sanitation. Even the work that we're seeing done across the sector with clean water, whether that be community-based or government-based, unfortunately, marginalized populations are still not getting access to many of those services. So I do think that we're seeing similar trends, right? Anything that we can say around kind of the impact on women and children, we could probably also pull in, marginalized populations into those groups. I do think that, this overall theme of global inequality really would just pattern a lot of what we're seeing in gender inequality, right? Or these issues of hunger and gender inequality. And it's something that I think over the last year or two, the humanitarian or international development sector as a whole is really starting to take a hard look at, right? And better understand why some people are left out of these solutions. It's not just about access to very rural communities, but it's about systems. And I think the number thing to do to mitigate some of that, not easy, but it starts with being able to see and think in terms of systems, not just your little solution, but really understanding who are all of the factors and actors and elements that are at play here. This idea of systems thinking and creating kind of a systems approach change, right? That's really the only way that we'll be able to reduce that overall global inequality, is if we're looking at overall systems change.
All right. Thank you, Julie. This was fantastic. There's just so much to chew on, pun intended here, right?
Lots of great puns too.
Yeah. And I want to also thank you to our audience and some of the great questions. And this does conclude our last session of our Environmental Ethics Symposium this year. A reminder to those of you still out there that all of this will be on YouTube, so you can go back and watch it at your leisure, and it'll be available to you. So thank you to everyone involved.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's been a pleasure.